I had believed that the day couldn't possibly worsen, but I was mistaken. The entire week at work had been dreadful, and to top it off, my boss, the company president, called me into his office to reprimand me for a mistake made by someone else. Upon arriving home, I discovered my sister-in-law's car blocking my driveway, preventing me from parking in front of my own house. The neighbor's teenage son and his friends had filled the street with parked cars, forcing me to park 3 doors down. My relationship with my wife's sister Susan had always been strained. Since the day we met, I couldn't fathom why, but she seemed to harbor an immediate dislike for me. Furthermore, I had little hope for an intimate evening with my wife Janice, as we hadn't been intimate in almost a month despite my persistent efforts. Arriving at my driveway, I noticed an empty garbage can by the curb and dragged it around the side of the house, through the side gate, placing it next to the back door entering the kitchen. I heard music and the chatter of my wife and her sister in the living room grabbing a beer from the refrigerator. I took a swig before heading towards the living room. However, a sentence overheard at the door froze me in my tracks. "Gotti banged me 3 times today." This came not from my sister-in-law, but from my beloved wife. "Ever since Brandon came back last month, I just can't get enough of him," my wife confessed. I knew Brandon as my wife's ex-boyfriend who had left her and moved away. Curious, my wife's sister asked, "So what are you going to do now?" Janice replied, "Brandon wants me to move in with him, so I'll get a lawyer and file for divorce. This is a community property state, so I'll get half of everything." I had heard more than enough. I quietly made my way to the back door and retraced my steps to my car. Opening the door, I sank into the driver's seat, now realizing the reason I had been denied any intimacy. My wife was sharing it with someone else, and now she wanted half of everything. The worst part was that the state was likely to grant it to her. Janice and I had tied the knot just 3 years ago. She had quit her job right after vows, and when she was at home, she never lifted a finger. I hired a maid 3 times a week for house cleaning and laundry, and on those days she would cook. For dinner the rest of the time, either I cooked or she ordered takeout. I know what you might be thinking, but love put blinders on me. She kept me happy by providing good sex, at least until a month ago. My mother passed away when I was 13, a devastating loss for both my father and me. Dad did his best to raise me right, and we became very close. Losing him to a drunk driver when I was 23 was a significant blow, occurring just a year before I met Janice. Inheriting nearly $2.5 million from Dad, I wisely kept the money invested with the guidance of a good broker, despite Janice's attempts to spend every dime I earned. I had another $100,000 in savings. I had never touched the inheritance, making it grow even in the current economy. I had enough to live comfortably, and I didn't have to spend it. My love for Janice led us to skip a prenuptial agreement, a mistake many make, thinking their marriage will last forever. This oversight meant she could potentially take almost $1.5 million from me, all for the privilege of spreading her legs. The state seemed all too willing to support this legalized form of exploitation. She had mentioned getting a lawyer, which meant she wasn't yet prepared to serve me. I knew I had some time to act, formulating a plan. I sat in my car, keeping an eye on the rearview mirror until I saw my sister-in-law's car pull out and drive away. I started the car, made a U-turn, and walked back to my driveway. Upon entering the house, Janice was now here to be seen, so I headed to the kitchen for another beer, popping the top and taking a long sip. As I contemplated my next steps, "Oh, there you are, honey," Janice greeted, entering the kitchen. "I didn't hear you come in." "Hello, dear. Just got home." "Been a long day," I replied with a loving smile, determined to play the role as convincingly as she did. "I didn't have time to order anything for dinner," she said. "I wanted to say that's because you spent your day with your boyfriend and sharing all the details with your sister." What I uttered was, "That's okay, sweetie. I'll just heat up some leftovers from last night." Janice gave me a sweet smile, kissed my cheek, and announced, "I'm going to go up and soak in a hot bath." Smiling and nodding, I thought, yeah, I got to wash all that away. When she left, I grabbed a box of fried rice and ate it cold while downing 2 more beers. After tossing the empty container, I retreated to the den, settled into my recliner, channel surfing. I settled on an old John Wayne Weston when Janice returned half an hour later. She sat on the couch until the movie ended. Standing up, she claimed she was tired and heading to bed. Yet tired from being unfaithful. I told her I would watch the news and join her later. I hadn't really paid attention to the movie, my mind occupied with plotting my next move, knowing I couldn't do much until Monday. I endured the next few days, working in the yard on Saturday and playing golf with buddies on Sunday. On Monday, I called my broker handling my inheritance portfolio and had everything liquidated. Being in upper management allowed me to cash in my $401k swiftly, penalty be damned. By Thursday, I was ready to make my move. Returning home to my supposedly loving wife, I informed her of an emergency situation, explaining that I would be flying out for a week on company business. I packed 2 suitcases. That was all I needed. When we moved into this house, I had stored everything important to me because none of it fit with her taste. So there was nothing else I desired. The furnishings were her choices, and frankly, I couldn't care less about them. The silver lining in this situation was that we were renting the house, so I had no financial investment tied up in it. Having recently sold my condo, we were in the process of finding the right house to buy. When I say right, I mean right according to her standards. So far, none of the houses we had looked at seemed to meet her criteria. On a Friday morning, I kissed my wife on the cheek one last time and carried my suitcases out the door, loading them into my Lexus. I drove away without a single backward glance. My first stop was at an old buddy's place, Jake, whom I trusted implicitly. He was astonished when I proposed trading titles for his older but rebuilt 4-wheel drive vehicle. Confiding in him about my situation an hour later, I was headed west. I doubted anyone would connect me to this vehicle, and Jake promised to keep the car I traded him hidden in the garage for a while. For the next 4 days, I paid for everything in cash. I had canceled all our credit cards to avoid leaving a paper trail. The majority of my money was now safely tucked away in an offshore account thanks to my broker. I had a system in place with him to arrange fund transfers when needed. I had enough cash hidden in the SUV to last for a while. The nights alone in motels were the toughest for the past week. I had been too occupied with executing my plan to reflect on what had happened to me personally. I had loved Janice. I wouldn't have married her if I hadn't. I played through various what-if scenarios in my mind, but ultimately I concluded that there wasn't much I could have done differently. Even if I had known her old boyfriend had returned, I doubted I couldn't have kept them apart. I arrived at 2 conclusions. She probably never truly loved me, and it was my own fault for being foolish enough to marry her. On the 5th day away from home, I found myself sitting in a mom-and-pop diner in a small town in Montana. I pondered what my supposedly loving wife was up to, as by now she must have discovered that all her credit cards were canceled and our bank account held no money. My thoughts were interrupted by an older couple at the next table whose quiet conversation I couldn't help but overhear. The man, who appeared to be in his late 50s, was telling his red-haired wife about his wish for an extra hand on their farm. Unfortunately, they couldn't afford to hire anyone until their current calves were ready for the market. Even then, finding someone willing to work for what they could pay proved to be a challenge. Finishing the last bite of my meal, I stood up and approached their table, expressing my apologies for eavesdropping, but suggesting I might be able to help them. "I'm sorry for overhearing, but maybe I can assist you." I know the older man was scrutinized me and sizing me up in his mind. He said to me, "I don't see how you could do that if you heard what we were talking about. You know I can't pay you anything. What if I just need a place to stay in exchange for my labor?" I proposed. His eyes narrowed. "Colleen, excuse us for a moment while I speak to this young man outside," he said to his wife, standing up. He waited for me to follow him once in the parking lot where our conversation would remain private. He turned to face me. I estimated him to be about my height. 6 feet with broad shoulders and not an ounce of fat. His once dark hair was mostly gray, and his face showed the rugged lines of years spent working outdoors. His dark brown eyes bore into me. "Who the hell are you? Are you part of that Wilson bunch?" he asked with a hint of suspicion. I raised my hands defensively. "Hold on there, mister. I don't know anything about any Wilsons. 4 days ago, I was living in Texas, and I just arrived here this morning. I thought maybe we could help each other out. If what you say is true, why would you want to help us out? I can't afford to pay you. What's in it for you? If you're on the run from the law, we don't need that kind of trouble. I'm probably on the run, as you put it, but not like you may think." I proceeded to share my story about my unfaithful wife wanting to take me to the cleaners and how I could use a place to stay for a while. "I haven't robbed or killed anybody. I'm just trying to keep what's rightfully mine. If you have a place I could stay, I'll repay you with my labor. I'll pay my own way, and if you don't think I'm any help, tell me, and I'll be on my way with no hard feelings." He studied my face. "Son, if what you're telling me is the truth, I think I'd be a fool not to at least give you a shot. I have to tell you up front, though. The Wilsons are trying to get me to sell my ranch to them. They haven't done anything underhanded yet, but I wouldn't put it past them. You might be biting off more than you can chew." I informed him that it was a risk I was willing to take. Bill then inquired about my ranching experience, and I was honest, admitting that I had spent a few summers on my uncle's place in Texas, but I wasn't a cowboy. He extended his hand, and we shook on our agreement. Bill suggested I called him by his first name, and I introduced myself. We walked back into the diner where Colleen awaited. "Colleen, this is Carson Jones. He's going to be working for us if he can handle it," Bill announced. Colleen stood and extended her hand. I shook it, and she greeted me warmly. "It's very nice to meet you, Carson." Her voice held a clear tone with perhaps a lingering hint of an Irish accent. Like her husband, she was trim and fit, radiating a pleasant demeanor. "It's nice to meet you too, Mrs. I realized Bill hadn't mentioned his last name. Buckman, the last name is Buckman, but you just call me Colleen. Don't really have much use for formality in this part of the country." I instantly liked this gracious lady. Bill suggested we head back to the ranch. Before leaving town, he pulled up to a general store and we both stepped out. "I thought you might want to pick up some clothes suitable for ranch work," he said. "Yeah, you're right. I don't think what I brought with me would last long," I replied, grateful for his foresight. Entering the store, Bill received a warm greeting from the owner. Clearly a regular customer. 40 minutes later, I had enough jeans, work shirts, a coat, and a pair of Western-style riding boots for a week. It was sufficient for the time being. From the general store, it was about a 25-mile drive to the main gate, arched with the name Rocking Bee Ranch. That was Bill's brand, a Rocking Bee. Another mile of a private road led to the main house perched on a rise. Their two-story house looked well-maintained and freshly painted. Behind it, a barn and several buildings came into view. The pickup they drove was partly loaded with sacks of groceries, indicating their weekly trip into town for supplies. I pulled up behind them, filled my arms with bags, and followed the Buckmans into the kitchen. In 2 trips, we had the truck unloaded. Bill instructed me to drive around back, where he showed me a small cabin for my stay. As I pulled around, I saw him standing in front of the cabin. When I got out, he pointed to the cabin and mentioned that Sam used a similar one a few yards away, adding that Sam was out making the rounds and I would meet him later after unloading my bags. Bill waited while I settled into the cabin. It had a single large room with a bed along one wall, a table with 2 chairs, a pot-belly-wood stove in one corner, and a bathroom with a single-stall shower. It wasn't luxurious, but it was clean and served as a suitable place to stay for now, at least allowing me to hopefully avoid being found by Janice. When I returned outside, Bill was sitting in his pickup and told me to hop in. He took me on a tour of the ranch, which covered almost 6,000 acres. 5,000 acres were relatively flat and suitable for grazing, with a couple of hundred acres set aside for growing winter feed. The back section of the ranch was hilly and covered in forest, which led to mountains with a stream flowing through the property, accessible only on horseback. Bill shared that he used to have 3 full-time hands, but Sam was the only one left after tough times. Sam had been working on the ranch for nearly 30 years. During roundups for selecting stock to take to market, they hire extra help. Bill dropped me off at the little cabin around 5 p.m. "By the way, I noticed you carry a laptop. I've got a satellite connection with a router, so you can access the internet wirelessly. Supper is in the main house, and we normally eat at 6, Bill mentioned before driving away. In less than 30 minutes, I had settled and leaving me time to boot up my computer. As Bill had mentioned, I was able to make a wireless connection, and I quickly checked my email. There was one message from Jake stating that Janice had reported me missing to the police, and they were investigating my disappearance. It gave me something to ponder. Jake was the only one I had actually told about leaving, and even he didn't know where I was going. I had mailed my resignation to my former employer, but hadn't informed them in person about my departure. Just before 6, I walked over to the main house and knocked on the kitchen door. Bill called for me to come in, and as I stepped inside, I saw Colleen preparing food while Bill stood to the side talking to a man I assumed was Sam. Bill motioned me over. "Sam, this is Carson, the new hand I mentioned, at least for today. We'll see how he feels about it tomorrow after a day's work," Bill said with a broad grin. "Carson meets Sam." Sam gave me a warm smile and extended his hand. A big man, at least 6 feet 3 inches. He, like Bill, appeared to have worked hard throughout his life and seemed around the same age as Bill. One notable detail, he was African American. I shook his hand, sensing the strength in his grip. "Well, young man, let's hope you like it here." I could use the help, he said. At 28, I was about half his age, so he considered me young. "I planned to give it my best shot," I replied. Just then, Colleen called us to sit down as supper was ready. Bill and his wife sat at opposite ends of the table, leaving Sam and me to sit between them across from each other. On the table were a large platter of pork chops, a big bowl of mashed potatoes, another with fresh green beans, and a plate stacked with obviously homemade biscuits. "We don't eat fancy here, Carson," Colleen said, "but there's plenty, and it's filling." My mouth watered. "It looks great," I replied. As we ate, I asked Bill if he had been here all his life. "Yep. My grandfather started this ranch and passed it on to my father. Now it belongs to me and Colleen." Bill paused as if in thought. Although when I was younger, I wasn't so sure she was going to be a part of it. I had to fight off every man in 3 counties to get her. Bill looked at his wife, and I could see the depth of his love for her in his eyes. Now, Bill, you know you're the only man I ever had eyes for. I just had to make sure that you wanted me enough, Colleen said. My wife has been responsible for the 3 happiest days of my life: the day she agreed to marry me, the day she did marry me, and the day she gave birth to our daughter, Bill said. I hadn't seen any sign of a daughter, and Colleen must have noticed my curious look. Our daughter is away right now. She is finishing her doctorate degree in veterinary sciences at South Dakota State. She has only been able to get home for the holidays, and we are anxiously waiting for her to come back home with her degree. She's supposed to be home in a couple of months, Colleen said. It'll be nice to have a vet in the family. Should cut down on some of the expenses, Bill added. With a grin after dinner, I attempted to help clear the dishes, but Colleen insisted that it was her job and made me go away. Bill mentioned that breakfast was at 5:30 and work would commence at 6. As Sam and I were leaving, I noticed a copy of today's New York Times on the counter. I asked if I could borrow the front page, and he agreed. Once outside, I asked Sam to step into my cabin for a moment. Inside, I took out my digital camera and showed him how to use it. I had him take a close-up of me holding up the front page of the newspaper. I could tell he was curious, but he didn't ask. He did inquire about an alarm clock, and I assured him I had one. He said he would see me in the morning and left. I downloaded the picture to my computer and pasted it into an email along with a note to the police in my former hometown. The message stated that I was alive and well, and I had left town of my own free will. Choosing a national newspaper instead of a local one kept my location ambiguous. I sent the email to Jake and instructed him to use one of the local coffee shops with free internet access. As my work email would likely still be active, I provided my password so he could forward the original email and picture to the police without leaving any traceable paths. This way, I hoped to avoid being listed on any FBI or national missing person lists. Assuming the police wouldn't allocate extensive resources to search for a runaway husband. I slept soundly that night. The next morning, I was up at 5 o'clock, showered, and dressed in time to walk with Sam to the main house. Breakfast featured eggs, sausage, hash browns, and toast. After eating, Bill instructed Sam to put me to work replacing fence posts in the hilly section. Following Sam to the barn, he pointed out a horse and saddle I would need, keeping a close eye on me. Sam seeming satisfied with the way I saddled the big brown saddle, drawing on my experience from my uncle's ranch. We then took 2 mules attaching saddle packs to load fence posts and a post hole digger. Bill joined us at the barn carrying a Winchester Model 95, explaining it was mainly for the rare occasion when we might need to put down a sick cow. Mounted up and leading a mule each, Sam and I headed out following the creek up into the hills. As Sam and I rode, we engaged in conversation and got to know each other. I shared the story of how I ended up in Montana, trusting that he wouldn't betray my confidence. In return, Sam recounted his own experiences. He had married right after high school only to discover his ex-wife in bed with another man. In a fit of rage, he had nearly beaten the guy to death, resulting in a 5-year prison sentence. Upon his release, Bill was the only one willing to give him a chance, and that was how he had spent the last 30 years. Sam spoke highly of Bill and Colleen, considering them to be the salt of the earth. As the morning sun cast its glow on the breathtaking mountains, in the background it was the beginning of April, and though the snow had melted in the low elevations, some still adorned the peaks. Upon reaching the tree line, the trail began to ascend half an hour later. We reached the fence marking the property boundaries. Sam pointed out that not all the posts needed replacement, only those that had rotted or were close to it, approximately every 3rd one. He stayed with me while I replaced the first 2 to ensure I was doing it correctly. Sam suggested working until around 4, allowing me enough time to return, care for the horse and mules, and make it to dinner at 6. His parting advice was to follow the stream back down, ensuring I wouldn't get lost. Sam headed back, leaving me alone with my work. There was something calming and soothing about being in this beautiful hilly forested country. I progressed down the line, replacing old posts with new ones. At noon, I took a break and retrieved the pork chop sandwiches that Colleen had given me in the morning. From my saddlebag, I fetched the leftovers from the previous night's meal. They were just as delicious today. I quietly ate. I observed a blue jay passing through the trees, a woodpecker briefly stopping to hammer at a tree, and a white-tailed deer appearing in the opening on the other side of the fence. She cautiously approached until catching my scent, then snorted and bounded back into the trees, waving her tail in the air like a flag. I finished my sandwiches and returned to work. My watch alarm beat to 4 in the afternoon. I noticed that I had said all but a couple of the posts that the mules had carried up. Leading the mules, I traced back along the fence line until I found the stream and began descending. Just before leaving the trees, I discovered a natural pool where the stream flowed in and out. I stopped and admired the view, recognizing it as the most beautiful and serene spot on the ranch. Back at the barn, I managed to unsaddle the animals and get them fed. In time, while I was tending to the horses, Sam entered to bed down his horse when I informed him that I had said all but two of the posts. He seemed surprised and impressed. We rushed to wash up and change before supper, where we enjoyed steaks that night at the dinner table. Bill was visibly impressed when Sam shared the progress I had made during the day. Exhausted, I made minimal contributions to the conversation and excused myself immediately after dinner to go to bed. Sleep came quickly, and I slept deeply. When I woke up, I was sore all over. My hands ached from wielding the post-hole digger, and my arms, shoulders, and legs throbbed despite my regular workouts. There was a big difference between a 2-hour gym session and a full day of setting fence posts. As I limped into the kitchen and winced while sitting down, I received a couple of chuckles from Bill and Sam. Even Colleen couldn't completely hide her grin. However, despite the soreness, I was ravenous and eagerly devoured my breakfast, ready for another day of fencing. I felt Bill laugh. "I think you can give it a rest today. I'd like you to ride the rounds with Sam." I nodded appreciatively. The first task was to clean the stalls and replace the hay. After putting the horses and mules in the pasture and filling their feeder, we loaded up in the pickup and began our range inspection. Our primary goal was to ensure no cows were down or calves separated from their mothers. Sam's knowledge of the ranch seemed instinctual, and he effortlessly anticipated where the cattle would be and roughly estimated their numbers. After 30 years, it seemed to come naturally to him. As we reached the far end of the ranch, Sam stopped the truck and surveyed the surroundings. Something on one of the hills caught his attention, prompting him to hand me his binoculars and point to a specific spot. After a minute, I identified 2 calves seemingly alone. "Where are their mothers?" I inquired. Sam gestured towards 2 cows near the tree line. "That's them over there. Their calves must have wandered into the trees, got lost, and kept going. We'll have to bring them down." "Are we hiking up there?" I asked. "No, it's too far. We'll go back and load up a couple of horses." The pickups were equipped with 2-way radios, and Sam called Bill, informing him of what we had seen and that we were on our way to get the horses. When we returned to the barn, Bill had already saddled 2 horses and loaded them into a trailer. All we had to do was hook up and go. Sam navigated us close to the tree line below where the calves were, and we unloaded the horses. Riding up into the hills, Sam's 30 years on the ranch became evident once again, as he knew the terrain like the back of his hand. Half an hour later, we eased up behind the calves and slowly began to push them back down the hills. I couldn't help but laugh when we cleared the trees and the juveniles spotted their mothers. They ran crying to their moms and immediately sought out a tea to nurse on. The larger cows stood patiently, allowing their young to feed. It struck me how different it was from my childhood. That night's supper featured fried chicken, corn on the cob, and mashed potatoes. The platter was piled high with perfectly cooked breasts, legs, and thighs. With newfound energy, I talked more than the night before. I learned more about Colleen. Her parents had immigrated to the United States from Ireland when she was 5 years old. Her father, fascinated by tales of the Old West, had brought the family to Montana, explaining the trace of Irish in her speech. Growing up in America, she still retained the influence of her parents. The next day, I was to return to replacing fence posts. After breakfast, Sam helped me load up the mules, but this time I headed out on my own. Following the stream led me directly to my destination. This day proved to be easier than the first, as I had learned some tricks to make the work less strenuous. Just before 4 o'clock, I set the last post and headed back to the barn. With some extra time, I cleaned some of the stalls before cleaning up for dinner. On my 4th day, I assisted Sam in making repairs to some of the buildings, and the following day, I set more fence posts. The next 2 months flew by, and I now took my turn riding the range to check on the cattle. I was in the best shape of my life. We established a schedule where Sam took Saturdays off. Bill took off Sundays, and Mondays were my days off. I used my day to do laundry and run into town if needed. I had grown quite fond of everyone on the ranch. Sam was good-natured and easygoing, and we often sat and talked after supper. I had a lot of respect for Bill. He was honest and hardworking. I got along well with Colleen. She was very sweet to Sam and me, but I could see she had some fire in her. Together, she and Bill made a great couple. Colleen and Bill were growing excited at breakfast on Friday. Colleen informed me that her daughter would be returning home in 1 week. It was my turn that day to take a horse and ride through the wooded section checking for cattle that might have wandered into the hills. A little after daybreak, I made my way to the stream, turned to follow it down, and reached the pool below the waterfall. I stopped, dismounted, took off my shirt, and knelt down next to the water. Dipping my bandana into the cool water, I began to wash the sweat and dust from my face and neck. A figure from downstream caught my attention, and I looked to my right to see a horse and rider approaching. At first, I thought it was Colleen, but quickly realized this was a younger version of her. This beautiful woman could only be Caitlin. With the same crystal blue eyes and red hair as her mother, she rode up and stopped several feet from me. As I stood up and faced her, her eyes lingered on my bare chest, revealing the 2 months of hard work. She came up to me and asked, "Who are you, and what are you doing on this property?" "Name's Carson, and I work here," I replied. "I don't believe you." "My dad said he couldn't afford to pay another hand," she said. Despite her beauty, I was getting a little aggravated at her unfriendly tone. "Yeah, I heard that too. I guess that's why I laugh all the way to the bank every payday." Caitlin scowled at me, got on her horse, gave it a kick in the sides, and rode off. I chuckled to myself, put my shirt back on, remounted my horse, and continued towards the barn. Later, I found out there had been a miscommunication between Caitlin and her parents. They thought she was coming home the next week. Instead, much to their surprise, she had arrived a couple of hours after I had ridden out. She had spent the morning and the early part of the afternoon with her parents until she expressed her desire to go for a ride, something she hadn't had time for in school but loved to do. So she saddled up and rode to her favorite spot, the waterfall and pool of water. I guess after 2 months I was old news, and Bill and Colleen had forgotten to mention me. Just as I rounded the barn, I saw the back of the red head disappear inside. I dismounted and proceeded to leave my horse inside. Caitlin must have been looking for her father and finally found him in the barn. I could clearly hear her loud voice. "Who is that man that was up at the waterfall?" she demanded to know. Bill thought for a minute. "That must have been Carson." He answered, "He works here." She replied, "But last time I was here you told me you couldn't afford to pay another hand." "Well, he's right, he does work here. As for what he gets paid, I don't think that's any of your business. I still own this branch, young lady. Daddy, he says you pay him so much that he laughs all the way to the bank," she sputtered. By that point, I had walked into the barn. Caitlin had her back to me and didn't see me. Bill did and gave me a grin. "Is that true, Carson? If you think you're overpaid, I can rectify that," he said to me. Caitlin spun around and locked me in her stare. I pulled my hat off with one hand and scratched the back of my head with the other. "Well, I would hate to take advantage of you, Bill. Just how much are you thinking of cutting my wages?" I asked. After some silence, Bill and I both cracked up laughing. Caitlin continued to glare at both of us, failing to see the humor. "Sweetheart, just so you get that bee out of your bonnet, Carson gets to stay in the cabin next to Sam's," Bill said. "And what else?" she still demanded to know. "That, and he gets to eat your mother's fine cooking." "So you're saying you aren't paying him? Why would he work for nothing?" Caitlin persisted. "He has his reasons, and it's not my place to tell you," Bill said. "I would argue that working to have a chance to taste your mother's cooking is worth a lot." "I don't think she would like to hear you say that it's nothing," I chipped in. Caitlin shot me one more glare and stormed out of the barn. Bill shook his head. "She reminds me so much of her mother when she was young. I didn't think I would ever tame Colleen." At supper that night, we were joined by Caitlin. She sat next to Sam on the opposite side of the table from me. She gave me another sharp look. When I entered the kitchen, I waited until everyone had filled their plates before speaking. "Your mother tells me that you have finished your doctorate in veterinary medicine," I said in a pleasant voice. It was her one-word answer given without looking up. "Sam says that there is only one other vet in the area, and he's over 50 miles away. I'm sure you're going to be a very big asset to the folks in this area." Caitlin did glance up at my compliment. I thought I saw her eyes soften a bit. "Yes, that would be Doc Harrison," Colleen said. "He has more business than he can handle and is often needed in more than one place at the same time." "I agree with you, Carson. Caitlin will be able to provide a great service." During the rest of the meal, Caitlin talked with her parents and Sam, who had been on the ranch since before she was born. She didn't address me directly, and I for the most part kept quiet. This was her homecoming, and I knew her parents and Sam wanted to hear what had been happening in her life while she was away. As soon as I finished eating, I excused myself to turn in. I returned to my cabin and checked my email, seeing that I had one from Jake. He reported that he had talked to a friend of his on the police force and casually asked if they still considered me to be a missing person. His friend said that everything had been dropped after they received the email with the picture I had sent them. As for Janice, Brandon had apparently dumped her as soon as he learned I had disappeared with all the money, and it didn't look like Janice was going to get her hands on any of it. Of course, she couldn't afford the rent on the house we had been living in and was now living in an apartment working as a waitress. She didn't have the money to hire a lawyer to pursue me. I thought it ironic she had apparently only married me for my money and her boyfriend had only wanted her for the same thing, my money. The next day, I was still working on replacing fence posts. I now only did so about every third or fourth day. I had moved out of the area that was full of hills and was down where I could drive the pickup to where I worked. It really was easier to load the posts in the back of the truck other than on the mules. The morning after Caitlin returned home, I loaded the pickup with posts and drove to where I had left off. When it was my normal time to take lunch, I started towards the truck and realized that I hadn't brought my lunch with me. If any of us were going to be working away from the main house all day, Colleen would make sure we had a lunch, and I guess I spaced out picking mine up. I could have driven back to the house, but decided that missing one meal wasn't going to kill me. About a half hour later, I had just set a pole and was attaching the wire when I heard a vehicle approaching. I looked back and saw it was one of the ranch trucks. The truck came to a stop just as I finished with that post, turned around, and was surprised to see Caitlin get out. She had a small sack in her hand like the ones Colleen put our lunches in. "Mama said you forgot your lunch," she said, shoving the bag towards me. I reached out and took it from her. "Thank you, Caitlin." "That was very kind of you," I replied. I looked in the bag and saw it contained 2 sandwiches as usual. I took one out and offered the other to Caitlin, but she shook her head no. I shrugged my shoulders and went and sat on the tailgate of the truck to eat. Caitlin walked over to where I was standing about 5 feet to my side and just stared at me. I just sat and ate, keeping my eyes focused in front of me. "Why are you here?" she asked finally. I turned and looked at her and decided to mess with her. "You can't tell anybody. I robbed a bank and stashed the money. I'm hiding out here until the heat is off and I can retrieve the cash." At first, her eyes grew wide, then she glared at me. "You're a real clown," she huffed and turned to leave. I waited until she was halfway to her truck. "Caitlin," she heard me say her name, and stopped and slowly turned around. I married a woman who never loved me and only wanted the things I could provide for her. I ended up here because I just wanted to get away from everything. Caitlin again stared at me, and I think she decided I was telling the truth this time. She nodded her head and left without another word.